Hello, and welcome to the ALN 2020 Asset Leadership Forum, Restructuring America. I am Nick Kanoki, the Director of Technology for the Asset Leadership Network, and I'm very excited to be kicking off our final event for this forum. The event is ALN Thursday at 4 Special ALN Senior Fellow Forum. Two notes before we get underway. We have been getting interest in the ALN approach to asset leadership and asset management. So I just wanted to take a moment to let everyone know who's watching that there is a 2-week web course leading to ALN A55K professional certification starting November 9th. And you can see more information about that on our website, assetleadership.net. Final note before we start, if you're watching and have a comment or a question, we'd love to hear from you. Please just write that comment or question in the chat window. Or you can use the Q&A function of this Zoom webinar if you're comfortable with that. Either way, we do want to hear from you. And now, without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Jim Dieter, CEO of the Asset Leadership Network. Jim?
Great. Thank you so much, Nick. And welcome Senior Fellows, and welcome people attending online now or that might be watching it going forward. I'm personally very excited that we're at the end of a remarkable series of events over the last 3 weeks. For those that don't know, we've been doing this for a number of years. Typically, we've met in person at the National Academy of Sciences, or sometimes on Senate meeting rooms on Capitol Hill, or the Congressional or the Capitol Visitor Center, and other locations, hotels, etc. And that has its unique advantages. And we've really found some unique advantages this year in that it's like, and I hope this is what today's event is like, is you come out of a session and there's small groups talking, and they're talking about what they thought about that session or what that made them think about, or other reactions they might be having. Only you can't be in every one of those groups, and so you miss a lot of them. But we managed to capture those at almost every event that we have put on over the last 3 weeks, at the end or with overtime comments. So it's really fun to get to know people a little bit personally, even though we're online and not in person. So we have a number of senior fellows, joining us today. Not all of them. Some were busy making money. Unlike me, I'm sitting here at a cabin up in the woods. So, I'm enjoying myself today. But I thought I'll go around and call people's names. And if we could just, for a quick first round, if everybody could just kind of mention their name and, personal information about your job, whatever you'd like to share, and where physically you're located. And, maybe a little, just a quick statement of, what kind of what connected you to the ALN, or, what you think about, finding this and becoming a senior fellow. I should say, one of the things I wanted to say, our senior fellows is really, it is an honorarium, but it's not just an honorarium. These are all really experienced people with a lot of relevant experience in the asset management and related professions, who have agreed to be leaders and to make things happen in specific areas. Some new folks we're still working on defining exactly what the area will be. Others, it's pretty straightforward. So perhaps people could mention that a little bit if they like to. But Marty, you were logged into the call first, so let's start with you. Marty Rowland.
Okay, well, I appreciate the opportunity to share. Well, I guess I'm just going to introduce myself first. So, my name is Marty Rowland. I work full time at the New York City Department of Parks and Recreation, and most of the things that I do at that job is manage closed landfills, but also manage the environmental aspects of construction of new and reconstructed park sites. But the thing that brought me to ALN was my long involvement with an interest in infrastructure, having taught a course at Tulane University back in 2002. That was kind of like my entry, but then I went on to work with ASTM and developed a standard that I think actually I'm going to share about that standard, because I think it has some value going forward. But that's really who I am and where I'm going. I guess other things that are important is that I'm on the board of trustees for an organization called the Henry George School of Social Science, and I'm a certified hazardous material manager, professional engineer, a few other things.
And Marty was the one that made the connection to Mark Morial, who gave a great keynote speech. If you haven't seen it, go dig it up and go watch.
I was on the transition team when he came in as mayor, and I was looking at sewage and water board. Yeah,
that's good. Thanks. Art, how about you?
Hey, I'm Art Kurland. I am the Director of Capital and Asset Management for University Health System in San Antonio. We are the world's first and ANAB accredited ISO 55001 hospital. I met Jim at a property managers conference, and we spoke, and he asked me to join the Asset Leadership Network, and I'm glad I agreed to do that.
Awesome. Good. Thank you. Jack Kelly?
So I'm Jack Kelly. I've been retired since 2013 from a 36-year career with the Office of Management and Budget, where I did a lot of management reform work, and some of that management reform work had to do with assets. Some of y'all mentioned fleet management. So I wrote the budget instructions for justifying motor vehicle fleets, at least the original set of them. And I also wrote, for those of you who deal with government aircraft, I wrote OMB Circular A126, which has something to do with government aircraft. So I tell people, and I mean this truthfully, that now that I understand more about what we call asset management and more about the standard, all the stuff that I worked on when I was at OMB, from a medical metaphor perspective, was a series of Band-Aids. It was all about fixing very specific problems. Now that when I look at ISO 55000, to me, that's a lifestyle change. So that means, you've really got to get all the parts of your corporate body working together to have a healthy lifestyle. And there might be an occasional need for a Band-Aid, but it's a fundamentally different way of looking at management reform and asset management reform.
Thanks, Jack.
I'm having a ball with the ALN.
Yeah, speaking of lifestyle reform, Jack knows where all the skeletons are buried. That's a big part of his life.
At least the ones I buried.
And then there's a gentleman here who's sitting in a lake. He'll have to tell us where he is and where the lake is, but Bob Smith was one of the original officers of the ALN before we even had a name, before we decided what we were going to call it, coming out of our genesis in the US tag for TC 251 for ISO 55000. So Bob's an old timer with us. So, hi, Bob. Tell us about it.
Yeah, actually, we got together down in Florida, didn't we? Several of us, and didn't really know what the transition was going to be after ISO 55000 was published. And that's really what I guess kind of drove us to start the ALN. So it's been a fun journey. Jim's taken this organization to kind of where we envisioned it would be several years ago. It's taken a few years, but I think you're finally getting it there and kind of getting the outcomes that you were looking for. So it's pretty exciting. I'm a principal consultant working in the asset management reliability business area for a company called CAI. They primarily work in the pharmaceutical industry. And that's where I kind of focused most of my time. I worked with the International Society for Pharmaceutical Engineers and helped them develop a good practice guide based on ISO 55000 for the pharmaceutical industry. So that's kind of exciting. That was just published last year, November of 2019. And it's little by little starting to take a hold in the pharmaceutical industry. Yeah, the river behind me is actually part of the Henry's Fork of the Snake River in Idaho.
Nice, nice.
Currently,
when we started out, and really still, we had two Bobs, Bob Kaler and Bob Smith. Bob Kaler was in Silicon Valley and Bob Smith was in Idaho. So to differentiate them, we called Bob Smith Spud Bob, and we called Bob Kaler Granola Bob.
That's right. Yeah.
Thanks, Bob. Mark Giuliani is one of our new senior fellows.
Thank you. Hi, Mark Giuliani, president of Giuliani Associates Architects, and also work for a radio station in Delmarva. And I'm interested in the Asset Leadership Network because as architects, we seem to leave the scene right after the building goes into occupancy. And I think that's a mistake. I think the architects need to learn more about everything from the programming level, helping the owners design their facilities and then take care of their facilities in post-occupancy. So over the years, I've worked with Kimona Numa in developing some of the projects, and I've found it very interesting the way the technology is coming together, and so much so that we've expanded our architecture practice and started bringing in engineers to help us move forward with buildings and technology and assets.
Awesome. Yeah, BIM is becoming an overnight success now, right? Is that right?
Yes, yes.
Great, thanks. Eric Brown, why don't you tell us about, Eric was a huge participant in this events this week, so really appreciate that. But
I kind of got recruited.
I could go on about everybody, but I better be careful.
I found out, apparently you guys found out that I was good at emceeing, so you kept me doing it. At any rate, I'm Eric Brown. I'm the Director of Mobile Assets and Personal Property for DHS, and of course have oversight of all of the subcomponents, CBP, ICE, and all of the property and fleet around the world. Background a little bit, before I was at headquarters, I worked with ICE as the branch chief over property and fleet. Prior to that, I was a contractor with Unisys Corporation, responsible for 27 federal contracts and task orders that manage government furnished equipment. And prior to that, Air Force. And of course, in my 20 years in Air Force, 15 of which was as a fleet manager. So of course, one of the lines we say in National Property Managers Association is nobody grew up to be a property manager. I think I did. So I actually met Jim. When I started, I just received my 15-year pin with MPMA, and I want to say I met Jim back then. And Jim was fortunate enough, or I was honored enough to be nominated as Property Person of the Year in 2012 in New Orleans by Jim Dieter. So at any rate, that's me.
That's good. Thanks so much, Eric. Marlene Melamachi. Marlene and I go way back as well. Nice to have you on, Marlene. You got your camera working today?
No, I don't. Sorry about that.
All right.
Sorry. But yes, we do. We do go way back, 1970s, I hate to say. First time I met Jim was in San Diego at a national NPMA convention way back. I've been involved in asset management, property management for over 30 years, like Jim and Rich Culbertson. We have, and Eric, I just heard as well. Eric, I've met you off and on over the years. In the corporate America side, managing assets of all types and varieties as a contractor supporting various government entities, which is a wonderful background to come in play for an organization such as Asset Leadership Network, because it gives you a very broad perspective, an overview on assets from soup to nuts. And currently I am retired from Deloitte and living now in North Carolina, out in the Raleigh, North Carolina area. With ALN, I most recently have been involved with the A55 certification program and so-called director of that program. I and Marcia Campbell, with inputs also from Rob Librant, developed the certification testing and kind of been running some of the grading and things until recently when Mike and Nick have been kind of taking that on their backs a little bit, but it's a wonderful program, very exciting. Jim stepped up with some others in the group to develop some wonderful training to have others understand the basic principles of what ISO 55000 is all about, as well as 55001. So that's me.
Good. Thank you. That's a lot. Rich Culbertson, how about you? You got your, when you tried to turn your camera on in the earlier session, we got one eyeball. Is it working any better now or what? There you are.
I don't know. Can you see my full face?
We can see it from the mustache.
Anyway, I'm on my
up.
phone.
There
So.
you go.
That's right. To be a real leader, you have to have a mustache or hair on your face of some sort. Anyway, I think I was also born to be involved in asset management. Early on, my father purchased investment real estate. My grandmother did that too. She did that in Ventura, California. I think I was at 12, as well as other things dealing with real property. As a matter of fact, I still have a large portion of ownership of some of the property she has. It's been in the family over 100 years. And so I grew on from that to manage all types of assets, including receivables when I used to work for GE Credit. Also management, as far as hazardous materials and hazardous waste in decommissioning of a nuclear power plant in Western Pennsylvania. Then I went on to Syracuse. That's where I met Marlene through MPMA back around 19.
Rich Stubbs has a connection problem sometimes.
And I think it was like 19 early
my
80s.
audio, I look like I'm in a bad place. I cut out every once in a while. And can you hear me?
Yep.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Can you hear us?
I just can't. I don't have a. Yes, I do. And after Syracuse, I was with GE at that time, and also moved on to Lockheed Martin, and in the Delaware Valley. Took on a lot of more responsibilities as far as the corporate side, and doing company policy, but also getting involved in regulations through AIA, but also eventually around 2000 became a member of AFCM. Jim and I were also members of AFCM in the early days, of which we are still today.
There you go. Good. Yep. All right. Well, and I think Bob Leach, you're the last one.
Right.
So welcome.
Which is still in existence today, the standard of which DoD has and which is also a reference to ISO 55000. Thanks to Jim. And so I continue to be involved in asset management in various forms.
Rich, you keep dropping, so maybe we'll move on to Bob, and maybe we can get your connection stabilized. It's good. Now we can get you, Bob. By the way, that W over your head looks like a crown when you sit up. It's cute.
Yeah, if I sit in just the right spot, it's either that or a pair of horns coming out the side of your head. I haven't decided on this background yet whether it's going to work. Apparently, it's somewhere down in Atlanta. So I'm Bob Leach, and I am actually new to the private sector here for the last couple of years. Prior to that, turns out I'd been doing asset management from an early age. I started out on boats, and I'm a professional mariner by training and all. And there you kind of got to do everything, you know. And so I come from the operations side of things, and I inherited a lot of designs and plans and tried to make them work. And so, to my mind, that's kind of where a lot of this asset management ends up. And I was dealing with things that hadn't been thought through in a life cycle. So the more I learned about asset management, the more it just made sense to me about aligning all that stuff. It was kind of speaking to the frustrations I'd had in doing all that. I ended up working for the Corps of Engineers on some of their boats. I ended up managing their fleet. So when people talk about fleet, I think of an entirely different thing, um, which is interesting in and of itself. And that led me into working with maintenance management and the Corps' CMMS, and then leading into what at the time was Pass 55. And one of the challenges with that was, first of all, it made sense to me, but the Corps was trying to embrace they had a tremendous number of assets, disparate business lines, and trying to make sense of all that in terms of how do you apply your investments and prove that they're actually making a difference in terms of delivering the optimum value between all these disparate things. And there really was no mechanism for doing that. You know, we used to say, oh yeah, we have a way to prioritize. It's, you know, a bunch of people sitting around a table in a smoke-filled room pounding on it until somebody gives up, you know, which works. It's not that unusual. It's maybe not the best way. And then there were other challenges too, in terms of both real and personal property. The Corps had some unique things that didn't fit either definition. And so I think it was around 2013 or 2014, we'd been exposed to Pass 55 and really the beginnings of ISO 55,000. And it all started making sense to us at the Corps. But we didn't know that there was anybody else really in the federal world doing that, particularly with the civil works kind of portfolio. And we stumbled into a meeting somehow. I don't even know how we heard about it, Jim, of the ALN, and it said, oh, members of our tribe are here, you know. But they were all talking about real property and FCI and all that stuff. We're like, okay, that doesn't really work for us, none of that. But we like the concepts. And it's been a really interesting journey since then to really understand that what Pass 55 and ISO 55,000 offer is a lot of clarity, you know, at least from my perspective, where before we had people could argue different things. This gives you sort of an overarching way of defining those things in a much better way to have a better discussion. Yes, there are differences, but an asset can be defined so well, I think. At the same time, it can be defined very broadly, and so that confuses people. So to my mind, it's been very useful. And now I've been engaged with the ALN more closely and seeing that develop, particularly in the federal world. And that's been, I think, a great benefit, and there's a lot of potential for growth there, because from everything I've seen, people, it makes sense to them and there's a great need for it. So I'm looking forward to more.
That's good. Thank you, Bob. Thanks, everybody. So one of the reasons our fall event was so incredible, at least to me, was that all or virtually all of our senior fellows played roles. And of course, you know, all of us, you know, attended typically more than just the event we might have been directly involved in. But what I'd like to do, and I have a couple other questions. So I'm really going to ask you to this time around to keep it to 1 minute. I know it's hard for us, impossible for me. I'm already taking more than 1 minute for me. But to just go around and share one, you know, thought from the event. Is it something that surprised you, a takeaway, something that you think you can, you know, apply right away? But if you can narrow it down to one thing, I know we'll be cataloging a lot of other thoughts and sharing them going forward. But for now, just one thing. And anybody want to raise their hand to go first? Eric?
So one thing I can take away from it is no matter which session that I attended, which I did not attend them all, but no matter what session I attended, it seems like all of these things tie together into one thing. We might be talking about different things. We might be talking about facilities. We might be talking about vehicles or boats or airplanes. But at the end of the day, we're talking about this entire management system as a whole. So I think all of these things and how we manage them or how they're managed is basically the overall principle and the big takeaway that I got from every session that I attended. That's it.
It's good. In under a minute, you're good. It's good. Let's see. I saw Jack Kelly raise his hand.
Oh,
I think the big takeaway for me, there was so much content that it's hard to focus on any one of the sections of content. So my main takeaway is the power of essentially this video format to engage people and to capture for posterity the results of that engagement. And so that's something that we do, I think, really well at Thursday at 4. But I think we should really focus on continuing it. And by the way, I think that the conference really generated a lot of great potential Thursday at 4 topics going forward.
Good. Thanks, Jack. Bob, I actually did see Bob raise his hand.
yeah. I wanted to jump in there right after Eric, because I missed a lot of the sessions as well. Unfortunately, this happened to be a very busy few weeks for me, but the ones I did catch, I wanted to reiterate what he said about consistency. There was a lot of that emerging. I agree with him completely there. The one thing that hit me though, besides that, was and it really shown today in the discussion with Peter Kohler, and Bodwin alluded to it as well, was the impacts of government mandates to make or promote, I would say, the adoption of ISO 55000, at least the principles, both in Australia and in the Netherlands and in other places. And that's something that hasn't happened yet in the US. And I'm a little leery of government mandates, having seen some come and go. But at the same time, I think they can be very, very useful to spur adoption. And it's been interesting to see what GAO and OMB have been inching towards, I would characterize it as, in terms of providing guidance in that area. And so there's a lot of, I think, opportunity there.
All right. Who'd like to go next?
This is Rich. It's a little better.
Yeah, go ahead, Rich.
Yep. I think one of the most important things of this is that, in fact, everything's recorded. And even though some of us weren't able to attend 100% of the time, that we have the ability to go back and look and comprehend and stop and start and take notes or whatever, then that's better than, in fact, being in person. On the other hand, I also recognize being in person, those off meeting type conversations are also extremely valuable. So there's some puts and takes as far as this type of format, but for what we had, I think we did the best we could, and that was an excellent job.
Good. Thanks. Mark?
Well, I'd like to thank Nick, because Nick has been doing a tremendous amount of work behind the scenes, recording all these shows for everybody, editing out some of the gaffes, and then making sure that they wind up in the appropriate place so that everybody can go back. And there's not enough hours in the day to watch all of them, obviously, but you can get to go back at a later date and catch up on a lot of the information. There's just so much of it. It's really allows people would normally come to this event live and in person to virtually watch all the shows in the time that they want to watch them, at the time they want to watch them.
That's good.
Thank you for that praise, Mark. And I would just defer your praise to Mike Bordenera and Jim Dieter, who had the nimbleness, the mobility to change what they had been doing to this new format, to react to the current environment, and to do so in an impactful and graceful manner. And I'm just here to grease the gears.
Well, and hats should go off for Jim for not needing a teleprompter to keep all of the names straight and all the shows, all the shows straight, and who the guests are and where they work and everything. So hats off to you.
Yeah, well, I got a lot of cheat sheets because memory ain't it. Yeah, but yeah. Yeah, thanks, Nick, and thank Mark. And Mark's helping us in that area too, and has done some work with Nick, on the videos and on on further circulating them. So that's great. Marty, we haven't heard from you.
Yeah, for the 1 minute version of my takeaway, I attended I think every session. I missed a little bit of today's at one, but one of the big takeaway was that I was always pushing and asking questions and going in mind about what's the value that is being achieved And I think it was in the federal law enforcement session where it finally dawned on him, and somebody actually said it, was that with technology and other techniques that we allow people in the field not to do admin work. And that's where it really clicked, was that that's the value for that sector, is that if you can get people to be more effective, then you're achieving. It's not like building a building and doing these other things, but it was just for people to do their job better.
That's good. Thanks, Marty. And Art, I don't think we've heard from Art, have we?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. I think for me, it was really just profound to hear all the different sectors. And the one thing that I found that was, it's really obvious, but not so much until you hear it from everyone about those different asset classes and different industries. And it just seemed to me that the one connecting part was that they, regardless of the type of assets we were talking about, whether it's infrastructure, personal property, real property, everything has a life cycle that needs to be managed throughout, the phases of the asset life. And so that really came out for me.
Yeah. Thanks. That was I think it's part of what the U.S. delegation brought to ISO 55000. And there actually were earlier drafts where it was an infrastructure asset management standard. And I said, well, that's great, but if that's what it is, that's not what I'm about, at least wasn't at that time. And of course, there's other people involved. But the thought was, well, let's just use the word asset. And when we get to something that's only for one kind of asset, we'll talk about it then. And we never did. We never did. But it's part of the reason that ISO 55000 goes down to the level of the asset life cycle, or the asset management life cycle, we like to say. Because assets really don't, as Tony McGrail said, boats don't have baby boats. So the life cycle is really, it's a management life cycle. A management activity is not, asset life is a different concept. But yeah, it's very much the same. So that's actually a pretty good transition to maybe another question. It would take, maybe just only 2 minutes this time or something. But given all that we've done to this point and what we've learned through the conference and our own thoughts, in the area of you're interested in, where do you see the next steps? What are the next steps going forward? And that can be, from your own personal, here's how I'm going to apply it in my asset management system that I'm a part of, or it can be a larger context. Either of those or both would be fine. And I think Art's already got that answer. So I'm going to go backwards and start with Art this time. Is that all right, Art?
I don't have the answer, but I would say just to get the word out and primarily more towards the private sector, because it seems to me that the government is heading in that right direction. I'm not so sure I could say the same thing for the private sector, even from what I've seen in our conference, a lot of government agencies and entities participating, and I think that's wonderful. But I think there's a big opportunity too in the private sector, specifically hospitals, just so asset intensive. They're like they're little cities amongst them, within themselves, and not a whole lot are doing what we're doing in terms of asset management. So I think just getting the word out to the private sector and helping them to understand how they can become more efficient and even more profitable by engaging in asset management.
That's great. Thanks. Bob, did I see you raise, Bob Leach, did I see you raise your hand?
Not intentionally, but I'll go anyways. You know, I think I'd have to concur with what Art was saying about outreach and communication. It seems like the building blocks are in place. You know, the standard itself has been developing. So to me, it's more about application and figuring out how to make that work. And also, I would say there's several other concepts out there. You know, the whole notion of I'll call it reliability centered maintenance or maintenance management. You know, that's had a lot of focus over the years, and it's, I think, an integral piece to asset management overall, but they tend to get discussed separately sometimes. Risk assessment is another one, even though it's part of the standard. What I've seen is people doing discrete pieces of that rather than unified approaches. And so I think educating people as to, you know, really the breadth of what ISO 55000 talks about in a unifying kind of way, that it's all very complementary and understanding. The trouble is it's so broad, it by necessarily is that I think people can only focus on one piece of it at a time, maybe is the challenge. And there's nothing wrong with that. So I think in terms of communication, getting people to understand maybe incrementally as they mature into this, you know, hey, there's more. And now that you're doing that, you know, there's this piece here that can actually enhance what you're doing and all of that. I'll never forget one of the people I heard at one of the conferences somewhere was talking about, you know, how do you do asset management? You know, how did you do it in your case? And their answer was, well, you know, given all the complexity out there and the personalities and the challenges and the fiefdoms and the silos, he says, basically, I figured I could just start where I was and do what I could. And start making, you know, his world a little better, and then start growing from there. And maybe the messaging is a similar sort of challenge these days too.
Yeah. Well, Bob Smith, how about you? I know this is what you're all about, right?
Yeah. Well, I think the interesting thing is with like in the pharmaceutical industry is very, you know, heavily regulated. And so when you're trying to explain something like this, they're starting to understand life cycles as far as product life cycle and things like that. So I think this will naturally kind of flow into it with the good practice guide. And I really enjoyed the GAO's kind of presentation there of what they found with the FDA when they went through some of their labs. I think the more the government can understand that, they'll help transition that, I think, out into the private sector, which will be good too. But we're seeing more interest, especially in some of the startup and smaller companies. We're helping them develop their asset management programs, early equipment management, things like that is resonating pretty well with them.
Good. Thanks, Bob. Marlene? I just said Marlene, and Helene's in the next room, and she said, "You talking to me?" Marlene, do you have anything you'd like to share? And if you do, you're on mute. Maybe she stepped away. All right, well, let's go over to Rich.
Now can you see me?
Oh, yeah.
Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. The thing I think that is probably provides some of the most opportunities is the whole issue of intangible assets, business systems, the management systems as far as compliance, the management systems as far as internal communications, the whole issue of internal controls as intangible assets. I think that intangible assets make up like 60 or 84% of total assets of the S&P 500. So when you think about that, you know, are we managing the 16% or the 100%? And so I think that that's the message that has to come across. Unfortunately, or fortunately, that the 84% is usually managed at the highest levels of an organization, the C level. And so far, those folks don't necessarily have had the message on this.
Yeah, interesting. Cool. Eric? Mute, Eric. Sorry.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Yeah, I would have to go back to what Art said. I think it, it all aligns to what we were talking about early on, and how the government is already practicing those principles of 55,000 and tying all of these things together. And I guess Bob also mentioned the part about communication and exposure to other entities. I forgot exactly who mentioned it, but basically just to get the word out on ALN. I think this is a good thing to be participating in. I've enjoyed myself so far, and I've only been doing it for actually 2 years, but it's definitely been a learning opportunity for me. And being in the federal government, I do think the principles of 55,000 are included in pretty much all that we do. We might not, I don't think anyone in the federal government has actually, other than Al Green, when he mentioned it yesterday in their strategic plan about the certification. I think that the federal government, not too many organizations are saying, well, we just want to get ISO 55,000 certified. I think, again, they're leading their practices with the principles of ISO 55,000.
Good. Thanks, Eric.
Mm-hmm.
Marty?
Yeah, I guess there was 3 things that came up during the various sessions. And I think the first one was, kind of capped it up with Baudouin's talking about Canada and the municipal services, something that I think that ALN can take advantage of, especially with the idea of Mark Morial and his various chapters of the Urban League, that combination, we might be able to identify maybe one municipal area that might explore implementing the ASTM E3210 infrastructure management. So I think that's looking forward. But no matter who wins the presidential election, Democrat or Republican, I think there's always been a desire to have an infrastructure program, but I think everybody's fearful of just money going down a black hole. And I think that's where Baudouin's comment about not receiving money until you prove that you've managed the assets that you have. And I think that's the direction that I think ALN can go, where a requirement for somebody getting federal funding, they'd have to get, I don't know, certified, but at least have an E3210 approval or something, maybe not a ISO 55,000 certification, maybe that'd be too much, but who knows? But something that would give direction to the federal agencies.
Thanks, Marty. Jack?
So, what fascinates me about it is the question that fascinates me is how can we take the slowly growing footprint that we already have in this country of organizations that are either certified to ISO 55001 or are adopting it. And we heard from a number of them. And when I think of like Bob Leach's working group, which is still meeting, and to take organizations like that and help them grow their footprints, because they've got all the ones that are doing it are enthusiastic about it. They've got great stories. And so getting them to find peer organizations that, and whether that's in the federal government or the private sector. So for example, Art there may be hospital associations that Art could go and make his presentation to and say, hey, our hospital has adopted this approach. We're receiving terrific benefits. And we think some of the rest of you should think about that too. We had a conversation last year, I think Michael Bordenaro might have been in on it too, with Gary Merrow from the Atlanta Airport, Terminal Corporation. And he seemed interested in trying to spread the word among other airports. And I can't remember if Dr. Smith talked about that or not, but the idea of building on the people who have done it to convince their peers that it'd be worth their while doing it too. I mean, that's an approach that I think, we should really try to push.
Good, thanks. Marlene, have you rejoined us, or can you hear me? I know Marlene is also doing grandchild babysitting services, so she might have had a higher calling. That's good.
Yeah. One of the things that I think, there's been a couple things that I've heard the group talk about. Bob Leach touched on a little bit, and that was the holistic approach. Basically, viewing each one of these independent items holistically as it takes into account either the private sector or the federal government's approach to ISO 55000. The other thing that is taught a lot in the sales of radio is something called WIFM. What's in it for me? So one of the sales practices is explain to your potential customer what's in it for them, and it makes the sale a lot easier. And as I look at this and I look at what's being developed with this whole process of web conferencing, or whatever term you want to utilize for it, it makes a perfect opportunity. And you guys have done very well with the Thursdays at 4. So I think that to move forward and attract more private sector groups into ISO 55000, we need to find the few that have and get them to tell their story, and also utilize the federal government experts that have pulled this together over the years and have them show the benefits and the return on the investment that they've gotten, because it'll sell itself. We just have to tell the story.
That's good. So, Mark, I know you're quite the entrepreneur. You have that business, and you have the radio station, and now you're working with some real estate in Alexandria. Are you?
Mm-hmm.
Can you have any examples of how you're using these asset management principles in those efforts?
Well, I think most of it is still, in our particular case, a work in progress. But where we've seen the most enhancement is taking these COBE files, and we talked about it in our presentation, developing the program, taking that information, bringing it into BIM, so that the data only has to be put in once. You don't have to worry about clean data. You don't have to worry about re-entering the same information over and over and over again. And then taking that data back out of whatever you're using for your building information modeling and putting that into some sort of program that can be used by the building owner to maintain the building afterwards. Because that just reduces so much of the time that's spent putting in data, cleaning up data, and it allows you to make changes really quickly. I think we showed it on our episode where someone wanted to change a room name. So rather than going into the graphical information and changing room one by one, we could go into an Excel spreadsheet, change all the different room names or whatever data it was, and re-import it. And it took a matter of a few minutes rather than hours. So I think we're using it more in a production line than how owners would use it. But I know we want to take our firm to the point where we're helping owners utilize it to manage their assets.
That's good. All right, so we've got a few minutes left, and here's my challenge. Who has a question that they would like to ask either one or more of the other panelists? If you have one, just speak up. No takers? Okay, then we'll go to Mike Bordenaro, because Mike always has 5 questions. Why don't you join us, Mike?
Yeah, I was chomping on the bit for that one. I was like, oh, if I was there, well, I had one for everybody. Eric, I specifically want to ask you about this approach that you say the government is doing a very good job. And I think that the way, ISO 55001 calls for continuous improvement. So I think the way that there can be continuous improvement is to get the best practices to the other organizations, the other agencies. So what do you think can be the ALN's role in helping the excellent work that the federal government is doing to be spread across all of the agencies?
That's an interesting question. What can the ALN do? So one of the things that we do in DHS, I'll start there. One of the things that we do in DHS, we don't mandate. Of course, we have oversight, but we don't mandate what everybody does. We have program management reviews of each component to see what they're doing, how they're doing it, and if they have best practices, challenges, and all of those different things. And we bring those best practices back to the department and have boards where we can say, make decisions. When I was at ICE, one of the things that I did over there for improving practice or improving best practice was at the end of each inventory period or end of each session on whatever it was that was a project, we got feedback and to see what we could improve. Because again, being on high, you can't make all the good decisions without getting feedback from the people that are actually doing the work. So I think that's one of the things that was one of the practices I brought to the department as well. Fleet Management Council, Personal Property Council, we have all of those. And then we have Leadership Councils, the Readiness Support Council that we have to actually answer to. And then with the Readiness Support Council, we're trying to constantly improve and minimize those things. One of the things that I think Marty mentioned or somebody mentioned was what I said yesterday about relieving the officers and agents of the administrative work of capturing, data. That's the prime example, because we heard what the people said. We want to help you stop doing that. So whatever we can do electronically, we want to do that. So constant improvement is something that we strive for as well. And ISO 55000 does help us with that in principle. So what can the ALN do? I don't know. Keep advertising that. Keep pushing forward the need for constant improvement and collaboration with other agencies. So listen to them and see what they want, not just to say we're going to dictate from here. And not that ALN does that, but I would say this, just to listen to all of the different voices, put them together in a room, just like we did, and say, hey, give me your best practices. How are you doing this? And if somebody's doing it better than somebody else, let's talk about it. That's just like when Al introduced his strategic plan yesterday for ISO 55000 certification within ICE. I hadn't thought about that, even though we have a strategic plan in place. He's one of our components. So why not see if he's doing a good job with it and if it can apply across the board? So again, it's just listening to the people that are actually doing the work and bringing it all into a leadership place so that we can make good decisions. Some rules need to be changed, some laws need to be changed, but you don't know that until you listen to the people that are doing the work.
So does that mean that you will help us get a presentation to one of the councils?
Yeah, we'll
see that later. I won't put you on the spot right now.
Oh, hey, look, I'm always volunteering for something, so I don't mind.
And then Bob Leach, since you were so involved in the government, are there venues? You were asked, or Jack Kelly said how good it was that you had stood up the informal working group. Can the ALN help expand that, or is there an avenue that we could go through the federal government that you know of?
I should clarify that was initially more of a support group than anything. It was just a place for us to go commiserate and, share our challenges and things. Because it started very small, because it was between the Corps, the Bureau of Rec, and Bonneville Power Administration, which have significant overlap in hydropower generation up in the Pacific Northwest in particular. And then it sort of grew from there. It's interesting listening to this. There's groups like the ALN. The ALN, I think, is very beneficial for bringing together a bunch of disparate experiences and knowledgeable people, and us being able to leverage that. But when you get into something like the federal government, there is no federal focus across, I would say, the agencies. There's one within the agencies, within each agency perhaps, but not across the agencies. And we see that in other ways too. And I think you and I have discussed this too, the lack of an overall infrastructure strategy. This gets back to kind of what I was saying about government mandates, particularly from Australia, those examples, about good examples of where those things can actually advance this stuff. So I think there's a balance between, I would say, grouping together maybe for self-defense and better understanding and sharing experiences, and also some for want of a better term, adult guidance, maybe objective guidance, to be able to say, look strategically ahead and say, what do we really want out of this, and not necessarily out of self-interest, but almost a more altruistic plane. And that's, maybe a stretch when you start talking about government in the same breath, but I'm ever hopeful. So, and things like this can really help. And I think the ALN has a role to play to do just that, to encourage that sort of thinking, really. And if that's all that happens, that's a huge step forward.
Well, that's the National Asset Leadership Strategy that has developed into the sector asset leadership success strategies. So we're on that path. We just need a platform. Maybe that's best through a legislative area. Jack Kelly, you probably have a good insight on the platform for that.
It's, if I could have started my OMB career not knowing then what I know now about asset management, I might have been able to actually help do something. But unfortunately, I didn't. And
yes, you did. You helped quite a bit, but I know what you're saying. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I mean, and so far, and Jim and I have tried to communicate with OMB and get them to understand some of this stuff, but it's very difficult. And
so is there a platform, one of the councils, the CFO council, or there's got to be a way to get in?
What you have to do is you have to find somebody in a position of authority, and it could be somebody in an agency. It can be, it had to be somebody in an agency that can be the messenger and be the evangelist, if you will, because and quite frankly, I've been stymied. I've been trying to get Alex Curry to set us up contacts with the Federal Real Property Council and other groups, and it's like talking to a wall. So, the best way to do it, I think, is to get the agencies themselves to come together, a group of them that have done this and are enthusiastic about it, and start pitching it maybe first to their leadership, and then have their leadership pitch it to OMB. You cannot come in from the outside. At least I don't know how to come in from the outside and do it.
Art Curlin had his hand raised.
Yeah, I was just wondering if it's something that can be accomplished through our representatives, maybe contacting our state or senators or Congress folks and go that route.
Actually, Art, that's a great example, because you are in a district that should be very proud of what you've accomplished, and they should want to be touting their horn about you. And so let's follow up on that later. Great idea. Jim, I want to hand it back to you.
Well, that's good. We are just about out of time. We've had some senior fellow discussions before for different purposes. But I want to thank you all for joining this discussion today and sharing your thoughts. And hopefully we'll all see this as a network, and we can call on each other for more information and ideas and to share. Again, thank all of you for your participation in the fall events and the forum. I think Restructuring America was an apt title, and I think we think big, and it's possible to make it happen. The trick is to not get to rely on the experts for the details, and to focus on identifying the top level policy issues. I think we did that over the last 3 weeks, and I think we did some of that here today. And I see Nick. Welcome back, Nick.
Howdy, Jim. Yes, we are getting to the end of our hour here. And as usual, I would just like to kind of offer a soft closing, say thank you to everyone who's participated and who's attended. Thank our organizational members shown here on this slide, because without their support, we couldn't do what we've done here today and in the last 3 weeks and in the last years. Bringing people together to have these high-level discussions and share their stories, which is so important. So I just wanted to flash these up here to say thank you, and to say if any of you have to go now, you know, it's the end of our time, and we appreciate the time you've given already. But if you want to stick around for a few more minutes and kind of continue the discussion, please feel free. I think Jim and Mike and myself will, at least.
Okay,
That's good.
folks.
Thanks
I
again.
gotta go. Thank you much.
All right.
Thank
Art.
you.
I want to say something to Art.
Yeah.
So I was so fascinated by your Thursday at 4 presentation a few weeks ago, and also just about, you know, about the story that you have about what happened at the hospital. That Jim Dieter has gotten me to agree to do an NPMA, let's talk to the NPMA at their November meeting. And the title of the presentation is going to be from property management to asset management. And one of the things that I've written, whether I will do it all that I've written out, I'm not sure, but I want to mention your hospital as an example of what turns out to be, well, let me back up. What turns out to be more obvious than I had I never thought about is that most of the organizations that are certified to ISO 55001 are certified based on their personal property. There are very few organizations that are certified that I have found that are certified based on real property. And one of the ironies inside the federal government is that real property gets all the high level attention. You know, you've got executive orders, you've got, you know, OMB guidance, and all this stuff focusing on real property. And yet it's the personal property community that's further ahead in asset management. And you know, and Jim well knows Bob Holcomb was a real advocate of engaging ASTM to develop personal property asset management standards, which in theory should have been adopted by federal agencies because of OMB Circular A119. Now, the sad truth is that OMB Circular A119 is pretty much unknown even within OMB. And so even though it's a hugely powerful tool that's available, OMB just doesn't use it. And it's, you know, to me, that's a tragedy. So what I'm going to be talking about in my presentation is, first of all, I'm going to start it off with that irony between, you know, that disconnect between the high level attention and then the, you know, who's really doing the good asset management work. And then I'm going to talk about how basically if personal property managers, let me back up again. One of the problems, and this was mentioned a little bit today, a lot of people who are involved in personal property are involved like in the disposal side. And those aren't the people that you're not going to get a whole lot of attention if that's all you can talk about is the disposal stuff. If, on the other hand, you're involved in an activity like a hospital, and I'm thinking VA here, where you've got high value equipment and supplies that are mission critical, and the hospital simply isn't going to work if all that doesn't work, and the opportunities to save money by implementing successful asset management are huge. And so it's, you're either in charge of that set of personal property or you have access to the people that are, then you've got an ability to connect personal property management with mission success. And if you can make that connection, then I think you can get high level attention.
Yeah, I agree with you. Everything you said.
So that's what I'm going to be pitching. I'm going to be pitching the personal property management community to see the extent to which they can either partner with, or if they actually are in charge of a whole lot of this mission critical personal property, that they can take the lead in helping their top management understand the significance of ISO 55000 to their mission success.
Yeah, I think one of the issues is as it relates to hospitals, there really aren't very many that have a dedicated asset management department like we have. From what I understand, most hospitals just simply rely on their logistics or materials management departments to handle asset management, and those folks may not be equipped to do that at an organizational level. You know what I mean?
Yeah, the guy we need to engage is Ed Safdie. because Ed spent a lot of time at VA, and he was, even though he was on the facility side, he's a real smart guy, and he will understand this.
Yeah.
And he might have actually, if he has still input into VA, we might be able to get him to arrange an opportunity.
We're working that one already, Jack.
Oh, right, great.
The meeting wasn't over before I was emailing him to talk further with Ed Lifton, and we've got to do some formal layouts. But yeah, that's definitely going to happen.
Great.
But yeah, so Jack, if you need my help, let me know. I'd be glad to help you.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so I got to get off now, but I appreciate all of you. And Jim, this was a wonderful conference, and I enjoyed being part of it. And Mike and Nick, you guys were instrumental in that, and I want to thank you too for your efforts.
Well, you've been a great support, and thank you for bringing Mike Russo and your team to the table. You're one of the best examples in the country, and we thank you for your efforts.
Sure, and I'm willing to help anyone, anytime. Thank you so much.
So I just flashed, we'll see, Art.
Okay.
I just flashed up this chart from the NALS up here because we didn't have a lot of time to talk about this, or any time at this event. I guess maybe we put a chart up once, but I could really, talking about different asset types, and Rich was talking about it earlier. We're just talking about it here. But it really struck me in a lot of the presentations how I could make sense of those now because of this chart. Managing, the incredible, scope of assets that Bob Leach and his panel talked about. It's just mind-numbing. It's like, that's a lot of assets, but it's, in an overview sense, it's using constructed resources to manage natural resources. And there's using data and virtual assets and conceptual assets to get it done. So there's a lot of assets out there, a lot. Anybody have any final words they'd like to say before we sign off?
So are people natural resources or constructed resources?
Naturally constructed.
Naturally constructed. I like it.
Yeah, we intentionally leave people out. All life forms are not included. We'll leave that to somebody else.
I like that chart, Jim.
Yeah, that's a good one. Thanks. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you all again for participating today and in the whole conference. And every year we get done and we say, God, this is an amazing conference. Look, I can't believe where we got to, overall, from where we started to where we are now and what's now possible. And as somebody else said, I think we are starting to see that being an exponential increase. So who knows where we'll be at this next year at this time. We'll look back and look at that. Oh, that's all we were thinking about then. Look where we are now. And I think all of you participating is what makes that possible. So I think we're making a difference. So appreciate it.
And thank you, Jim, for leading us all into this.
Yep.
You're welcome.
Thanks a lot.
Agreed.
Thank you.
Thanks.